Today's challenge is to incorporate knit weaving into my strip of Corona hats. You are looking at 4 different knit weaving patterns that I'll show you, and you're looking at it sideways to fit on the screen better. Knit weaving shows up on the purl side of the fabric, so that becomes the right side in most cases. Therefore, we're going to change hems because the rolled brim shows up on the knit side. We don't need any closed cast on at all. This is the last row of the previous hat. I knitted in 2 rows of waste yarn only. I'll snip it and pull it out later. Change back to main yarn. Don't cast on, just begin to knit, and that will be the first row of our new hat. Of course, that would run, but we're not going to leave it like that long. After knitting our 16 rows for the hem, we're going to lift that row up and hang it on the same needles, effectively closing the cast on and finishing the hat brim all at the same time. It looks very nice and neat on the outside of the hat, and it is very visible. Here I took out a little bit of the waste yarn and held those stitches on an alternate piece of yarn so you could see how the hat brim will finish. It is not difficult to do a neat job of hanging a hem like this, but it is important to realize it will be on display. Knit weaving can alter the fabric gauge to varying degrees. The first 3 examples alter it so minimally that I wouldn't bother to figure it in. The lower version of this one really doesn't change matters much, but the Tweedy one has more rows using weaving, closer together, up and down, over and under more needles, and it can tend to widen and a bit shorten the fabric. For this few rows, I'm not going to worry about it for this simple hat, but if you decided to knit an all-over knit woven design that dense, you would want to swatch and check. You probably need a little bit fewer stitches and possibly a little bit more rows. Notice that on every one of my knit woven hats, I placed the pattern down near the brim and left the top area unknit woven. In other words, plain stockinette knit. This is because making gathered crowns would be really, really bulky with the added layer of yarn involved in knit weaving. Knit weaving is not included in the Corona bulky manual, so I have not yet figured out an automatic way to do it. But the method that I'm showing you now works on almost all knitting machines. I started on the carriage side, which you always should, because as the carriage moves across, it pulls more yarn into the weaving. And if you start on the opposite end, you can end up too tight. So starting on the carriage side, I'm taking a single contrasting strand of yarn, weaving over 2, under 2 with the needles pulled all the way forward, and knitting across. The weaving yarn will get caught in the stitches, but it is not actually knitted. In addition to the row knitted right after the weaving, I knitted 2 plain rows, then brought the needles forward again and wove under 2, over 2, all the way across with the contrasting yarn again. This time going over and under the alternate needles, the ones that I went over last time, I went under this time. 3 more rows, and then we'll change patterns to the denser over and under. This is over and under every other needle, over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1, all the way across. Knit 1 row, and this time I'm going to immediately go back with the weaving yarn, over 1, under 1, all the way across, and knit a row. Over 2, under 2, using alternating sets of needles is shown on the bottom. Over and under 1, using alternating sets is shown on the top. Now let's use the same yarn for a really different effect. Bring all the needles forward, then weave under 7 and over 1. This is going to create really long floats. Ordinarily, you don't want really long floats, but we're going to do something artistic with them. We'll knit a row, bring the needles forward again, wrap under 8 and over 1 again, this time using the same exact needles, over and under the same sets of needles. For this hat, I performed this operation a total of 3 rows, then knitted 1 plain row, and then lifted each group of 3 floats onto more or less the center needle of the batch. My sample is a little asymmetrical because with 8 needles that I went over, there is no center needle. 7 or 9 would give you a center needle and give you a perfectly symmetrical lift pattern. Incidentally, this is a great way to use up odds and ends of colors. I changed to the yellow here for practical reasons. I was out of the background color. However, it creates a very interesting effect to move into yellow after using it for the weaving yarn with the lifted floats. Yarns that are too thick or difficult to knit can also be interesting weaving projects. Here I'm using Lion Fun Fur, which actually will knit pretty nicely on a bulky machine, but we can get a different effect and also stretch our supply by counting under 3 needles over 1. There are a lot of weaving patterns you can do with Fun Fur yarn, but this is what I've chosen to do this time. For this hat, I did 6 rows of weaving every row. A couple of pointers concerning using fur yarns. It's not really worth the effort to be very fussy about perfection of your needles count because the lashes are going to obscure them. So after counting carefully the first time for your benefit, I'm just doing it pretty much by feel now. And if one needle is not exactly in the right place, it's not really going to show by the time we fluff it up. A couple of tips about working with Fun Fur. Because it is so slippery, on the very first row, I often anchor a loop of yarn knotted into it on the very first needle so it doesn't escape from me. Fun Fur never looks its best right off of the machine because some of the eyelashes will be caught in the knitting. We want to do our best to free them. I usually do it with my fingertips or a comb. Here I was using a knitting needle. See those hairs sticking through to the knit side of the fabric? The more of those that we can free and take to the purl side of the fabric, the better it will look. It's surprising what you can successfully knit weave with. Here I've made 4 strands of Fun Fur yarn held together. I've got a knot in one end so I can start with it on the leftmost needle. The carriage is now at the left. This step was preceded by the same hem that I showed you before, 16 rows, hanging the first live row of stitches to close the hem, then 3 stockinette rows because I want my rope of fur to be down near the brim, and now weaving across over 3, under 3, over 3, under 3. It's a little bit painstaking to do this because your composite yarn loves to catch on things. But take the time it takes and then knit that first row afterwards very slowly. And it doesn't give much trouble. All of the hats in this movie were knitted with 16 row hems. That really only gives us 8 rows of length. Then 34 stockinette rows from the top of the hem to the top of the crown, then waste yarn. Everywhere fur yarn was used, it was then fluffed up vigorously. As a reminder, all the information on setup, finishing, gauge, yarn, size is in the first movie, this one. We're beginning and ending every hat with waste yarn so we can keep knitting a strip of them, then gather the crowns and sew the edges of the knitting together later to finish the hats. My strip of hats is growing. I'll see you next movie and we will talk about some slip stitch ideas.